Hello and welcome to episode 43 of the 1001 Movies podcast, based on the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. This episode will be talking about Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1932 horror film, Vampyr. Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1928 film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, is considered one of the greatest silent films of all time. And although it's the subject of a future podcast, it's important to note that it put Dreyer's name on the map at a time when cinema had pinnacled from a novelty into an art form. Silent films would never be better, but during the early 1930s, as audiences embraced talking pictures, Dreyer immersed himself into making his first sound film. The horror genre was just beginning to pick up speed both in North America and Europe. Films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu reflected the popularity of German expressionism in silent films, and Hollywood was about to churn out hits like Dracula and Frankenstein. Dreyer was inspired to begin work on Vampyr by the short story Carmilla, written by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Carmilla, which has since been adapted several times for the screen, often with lesbian overtones, is about a young girl and her father who slowly come to realize that the girl's best friend is a vampire. Dreyer's film only peripherally borrowed from the story, although the film's titles credit the story. It mistakenly calls it In a Glass Darkly, although this is the title of Le Fanu's book, which contained a collection of short stories, including Carmilla. Vampyr is about a young man, Alan Gray, who finds himself involved with the strange goings-on within the home of an elderly man and his two daughters. Alan sees strange phantoms, such as visions of the man visiting his room at night and the suspicious activities of a doctor and his musket-wielding servant on the adjacent property. The elderly patriarch is later shot mysteriously, and his daughter Leonie seems to be suffering from some kind of strange malady. Alan sees her being assaulted on the estate grounds by a strange old woman, and Leonie later falls into a coma with strange bite marks on her neck. Alan later learns that Leonie has been bitten by a vampire, and he and the house's elderly manservant make quick work of impaling the vampire on an iron stake and disposing of its human henchmen. Now, although Dreyer was of Dutch origin, he made many of his films in Germany and France, which provided him with more actors and more money. Baron Nicholas de Gunsberg, the son of a Russian colonel, met Dreyer at a party and agreed to finance his next film if he gave him a starring role. Gunsberg went on to play Alan Gray in the film, although he was given the screen name Julian West. Ever eager to make his film accessible to as many people as possible, Dreyer actually made 3 versions of the film, one in English, one in German, and the third in French. This was made easier by the fact that there's so little speaking in the film, and all audio was added later in post-production. The process of actually making the film almost resulted in Dreyer's downfall. The tasks of being a producer, writer, and director proved to be too much for him, nearly resulting in the end of his marriage. This rubbed off on his colleagues during the filming, and in an interview in 1964, Gunsberg explained that Dreyer was, quote, very intense, a strange mixture of understanding patience and childish impatience that could turn at any time into fits of uncontrollable temper. He used to get scarlet in the face every time the camera started to click. I've never seen anyone get so red. After the film was finished, Dreyer's troubles continued. The German censor ordered that Dreyer trim the scene in which the vampire is killed, as well as the death of a man who was buried alive in a flour mill. The distributor shelved the film for a year in favor of films like Dracula and Frankenstein, And when Vampyr was finally released in Berlin in 1932, it was a bomb. Audiences booed at the premiere. The film fared a little better in France, where audiences and critics were more accepting of independently produced experimental films, but the damage had already been done psychologically for Dreyer. He tried picking up the pieces and making another film, but project after project was aborted. Literally at his wit's end, he checked into a psychiatric clinic and remained outside the public eye for the next 10 years. By this time, Dreyer's darkest days were behind him. After directing a series of documentaries through the 1940s and 50s, his final two films, Ordette in 1955 and Gertrude in 1964, became his most popular. But the stories of those two movies are the subjects of future podcast episodes. What did I think of Vampyr? Those unfamiliar with the film shouldn't expect, as I, perhaps foolishly, expected, a polished monster movie in the same vein of the films Hollywood produced at the same time. Independently produced at a time when silent films were making room for talking pictures, the bulk of the movie is without dialogue, and Dreyer relies instead on imagery to move the narrative forward. This is, at its heart, an experimental film before it's a horror film, with disjointed editing and a confusing sense of place. Near the beginning, Alan encounters the elderly patriarch in the middle of the night as he comes into Alan's room, telling him that his daughter's life must be saved. The man leaves, and his presence is never explained. He appears again when the narrative later switches to the events in his home with his sick daughter, and no explanation is given for why he was in Alan's room. Did he literally break and enter to deliver a message, or was this an image dreamt by Alan? Alan later wanders into an incongruous building nearby, in real life it was a disused ice factory, and sees shadows dancing on the walls, a man with a peg leg, a strange old androgynous woman, and the villainous doctor. There's talk of children yelling and dogs barking, and it's generally pretty surreal. Again, however, we don't know whether these images are real or if they're all in Alan's head, which makes Vampyr an extremely subjective film. The narrative breaks a number of rules, particularly when it explains to the protagonists and the audience the nature of the vampire. Rather than have all of this explained to us by some Van Helsing-esque character, Dreyer relays this information via passages from a book that Alan and the manservant read at several points in the film. At the time, this was probably over and above the title cards used in traditional silent films. And while this technique does admittedly seem a bit dated now, I mean, after all, who watches a movie so they can read a book, it's probably the thriftiest way to communicate the most information in the time allowed. At the end of the day, Vampyr comes across as a filmed interpretation of a fever dream, with strange images floating in and out of the frame, and a simple storyline which probably could have been told in half an hour without the imagery. This means that it may be a letdown for horror fans seeking some classic grand guignol experience, but at the same time it's a fascinating little experiment in technical effects and storytelling. That's all I have to say about Vampyr. Join me next week when we discuss Stanley Kubrick's 1971 crime drama, A Clockwork Orange. In the meantime, feel free to email me any questions or comments at 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at 1001moviespc, and look for the podcast's Facebook page. Until next time, happy viewing.